Hi, today I want to talk with you about a scientific term used in Toddle development called component madness. Now, you may ask yourself the question, what is component madness and how does it happen? Now, component madness is if you build a web application that works perfectly based on the page, vanilla HTML, vanilla JavaScript, where you have all the functionality, all your variables on the page, and you look into the Discord channel and someone is telling you you should do components, or you hear other people talk about components, and you take that page that perfectly works and you start turning everything into a component, and then all of a sudden you go back to your homepage and nothing works, and you are like, it looks nice and it's organized, but it doesn't work. And today I want to talk with you about, first of all, how this problem occurs, then why this problem occurs, and more importantly, how to fix it. Now, first of all, whenever you do any breaking change like something like this, you probably want to publish your branch with the version that perfectly works so you can always revert back that you don't have any issues with the live version of that website. That's very important doing the branching. So before you do any radical change to your code base, you want to make sure you publish the branch so you have that existing version saved, or you create a new branch, but then you want to make sure that you don't have any conflicts in there. But that's probably a separate video we have to talk about, just about branching. Now, what you want to do is you want to, kind of like untangle and work with events to get that data. But for that, I'm going to show you right now how we can do that. So inside of Toddle here, I have an empty project, and we first want to start probably one of the easiest scenarios here is an input. So I want to add an input field on my page, and we want to first get a working input, right? And I want to have a text area inside of here. Actually, how about we take a heading, right? We want to have an H1 inside of here, and we give it some gap. Look at that, beautiful. And then, of course, we need to have white text. There you go. So now I have an input, and I want that input to be bound to a variable, and this should show the input inside of here. Super simple. So I will create a variable called text. That'll start out empty, so it doesn't say null. And then I go to the input on attributes, bind it to the variable, go to the text inside of here, go on fx, and I will bind this to the variable. So now I got it perfectly working. When I type in hey, it's going to say hey. Beautiful. Now you are on Discord or you watch a video, and I'm not a fan of best practices because my philosophy is if it works, you shouldn't touch it, at least not in the branch in which it works, right? Never change a running system. But if you want to change a running system, what you would be doing now, you would take this component and this input, and you say, I want all the inputs to look the same. I want to work with components. And you're going to extract this as a component, and you will call this input, right? And you will create this. And now you're like, wow, yes, I finally got an input component. Amazing. And then you go to the page, and you see a few things. First of all, this thing says undefined. And when I type, it's not changing it with the variable anymore. Now you have unlinked the whole system, and it's not bound to the variable anymore. And that's probably the problem that you're facing right now. Now, how to solve that is you have to create an own life cycle for that components, because you can't just bind the component to the page. You have to create a life cycle for that component. Also, something really cool is we now have component styles, so you can change the background color and override those things in the component, which is something that is very big, very powerful now. That is amazing inside of Toddle. But just wanted to mention that. That's really cool. Now, let's actually, how about we reset the styling? Oh, now I messed it up. Maybe it's not that baked out of a feature yet. Here you go. Beautiful. Now, we need to get data, but there is no bind to variable in this component. So we have to create a whole life cycle for this component. So let me show you how we can do that. So first of all, we want to get data into the component. That's the first thing, and then we'll work with events. So right now I'm opening the component here, and attributes inside of components let us receive data. They're not like attributes in Webflow that you use for styling. They're like attributes are like runtime props in React, meaning those are things how you can feed data into a web component, into a specific element on the page. So, and then Toddle lets you artificially build elements out of other elements. This is what components are. They are web components. So it's not like an HTML element that is the component. So you add your attribute, aka runtime prop. If you're coming from React, you're going to add that in here. And we want to resemble this to be an input. So we're right now building an input field that's not an input field. So we need to build those life cycles ourselves. So this will have a value attribute, and we can add a sample value here for testing called hey. There you go. We have that value now coming in here. Now, for best practices, for the sake of making this easier, you probably want to also have a variable inside of the component that will have the value as well. Now, keep in mind that when you work with attributes data coming in and you will send data out of that web component, having a variable in the middle is sometimes necessary, not all of the times, but it will make isolating that element when you work with it way simpler, but it can cause more complexity. So be mindful of if you use that. Let me first show you how it works without a variable, and then we'll make a version with a variable. So right now I have an attribute data coming in. I could go to this input field, and I would go to the value attribute of that input field and bind it to the value attribute. And now you're going to say one thing. You're going to say, okay, when I delete the smiley, did the attribute change? No, because it's not a variable. You can't change the attribute based on elements or actions happening in that web component. So how you would get the data out is through an event. So let's just do one thing at a time here. If I go to the home page, you see this is saying undefined. But now you see this input, this web component here has an attribute. I can bind this attribute with the variable, and now the value gets in. But if I type, I'm still not getting any data out. So what you want to do is you want to go to the input, and we need to create an event in this web component housing the input that will send the data outside of it. So for that, what we want to do is you want to create an event called onInput. This is a custom event, and then we can add a test value, for example, saying, hey, so we can work with it. Now we have that event, now we need to call it. So what we're going to do is on input here, every input field has an HTML event called onInput or called input. That's the HTML input event. Event on HTML elements are whenever the user interacts with it, and they also sometimes have data in them. So we right now have an input event. Now let's just log to the console real quick this input event so that we can see how it looks. So if we go to log to console, and on data, I'm just returning the whole event data. If I'm now going on inspect elements, and we'll really quick go to the console, right? And I start typing, you will see that I'm getting an object full of data here that has target, and then in the target there is a lot of data, and there will be target value somewhere inside of here that will contain the value of that input field. So keep in mind, every input field on this event, you get all that data back. So there's a lot of data moving. The way we only get the data that we want is by using event target value. If we do event target value on an input, for example, we're going to go to the console here, and we'll start typing, and we see that I'm now creating those events here with the latest information. I'm getting that detail of that input event with the event target value and from the value attribute, as that's what updates an input field. So now we have this event, but we need to actually send this event one layer out to the page, because the main operation will happen on the page or wherever this input is embedded in. So for that, we're going to trigger our custom event, which is a custom HTML event that that component itself will have. We will do the trigger on input. We go on FX and we will send the event data from the input event target value. So we have an input event here on the input. We will get that data from the input event, and then on the component, on this web component that the input is in, the web component is now built to resemble an input field. So the component itself will have an event too to then communicate the data to the page. So we're going to remove the console log. And now, as you can see, we can go to this page inside of here. And now I can type. And if I go to this input in here and I have on input, that is the event, we know this will return me the whole data of that input. So I can go and set the variable text with the event data I'm getting back. So now if I close this and I type something inside of here, we see that we have a life cycle now from the component updating those information. That is what is very important to consider. Now, there are a few other things you want to take a look at. Now, what if this input has some sort of validation where it says, hey, this is, I don't know, this needs to be 15 characters long. Right now, the input itself doesn't have any state of what's currently typed in it, because the event coming out is just going straight to the page, and the data coming in, we only have the initial value, and the data in the input itself can't be accessed by the page. We are not tracking the state of that component. So that component's lifecycle only exists to set the initial state and to send new events back to the page. The lifecycle now happens on the page. But sometimes you want to have that lifecycle on the page, but also inside of the component if the component has some functionality. So let me show you how we're going to do that. So let's do something very simple here. Let's wrap this in a div block, right? And we're going to make something fancy. Let's make this with 100%. There you go. We're going to change it a little bit so it's easier to take a look at that. We can close the console. And now what I want to do is I'm just going to add a div block inside of here. That's going to be absolute, right? 1 rem, and I will go to the parent and make it center. So I got that centered in here. Width will be 1 rem by 1 rem. There you go. And inside of this div, I'm going to make a checkbox, and we will show this checkbox. So let's go to Relume icons. And I'm going to show a checkbox if it's longer than 5 characters or something like that. Just a very simple demo here to showcase that. So let's look at check. We'll copy the check. There you go. And I'm going to put it in this div. And I maybe want to center it. And let's make that 18 pixels by 18 pixels. And I'll take this and I make the text color white. So now I just want to show and hide that. Very simple. Now there's nothing to bind that show and hide to, because that component itself doesn't have something called a life cycle. There's no state to be tracked of what's currently in the input. And we can't bind this input to a variable inside of the component, because then we'll lose the functionality to insert new data in it. So what are we doing here? So with that, we need to be a little bit more careful in how we want to structure that life cycle of the component. That's why I'm suggesting for beginners, don't listen to anybody telling you you have to make everything a component and that's the only way to make it scalable. If you are building something, it's not about following best practices. It's not about having everything organized. It's about having something that you feel confident maintaining, that you feel confident working on. Don't build a ginormous monster that you build one time and you're happy it's over and you never want to touch it again. That is not how you should be developing. If components help you make those things easier, use components. But if they don't help you and you have to force yourself using components and it gets too complex for you to oversee how those relations work, I would not suggest to use components at that given time. I have things where I use a lot of components. I have things where I don't use any components. That just always depends on the nature of the project, what you're building, how complex it is, how often you're going to maintain things. And I don't see any downsides in using a page-based approach if it helps you make changes easier and faster. At the end of the day, it's not about following some sort of philosophy on how to develop things. It's about finding your own way of doing things efficiently and effectively and having something that you can live with, you can work with, and you can manage, and that works for you. But, let's just continue on the state of that component here. So we want to create a variable here, and that will be value, and that will start empty. Now, the initial value of that attribute will be the initial value of this variable will be the attribute value that we have inside of here. So we're going to bind that. So now we see when we reload the page, this kind of like simulates the initial life cycle of that variable. We see this variable is hey, and the initial value is hey. Now, what we need to do on this input, we need to do a few changes, because what we need to do here is the value from this input now doesn't come directly anymore from the attribute, but it comes from the variable that is synced with the attribute so that we keep the state. That is the first change. The second change is when we do a change, we are still sending an output event, but the output event will not have the event data. We're going to now do one thing. We're going to go over the onInput event that sends data out of the component, and we're going to add a set value variable action. And we're going to set the variable with event target value, the data that we would send out. And then after we have set the variable, so we have that lifecycle now also within the component, but synced with the page, we're going to have an onInput event sending the data that is in the component outside of the component to the page, and we're going to send the variable value so that we have a sync of what is in the component gets sent to the page and nothing else if there would be some sort of issue with that. So now we have that state available. So as you can see, if I'm going to correct this, I'm now going to see that this current value of the variable was corrected, right? The attribute doesn't correct because that only gives us the initial state of the element. But this variable was corrected. Now there are a few things that are to consider. What if when this attribute changes, we want to change the input too? Because right now, if that attribute changes, because the initial value only happens on initialization, on load, on the first life cycle, when we have that element on the page, there is a life cycle, but maybe let's say you have an API and the data comes in a little bit delayed, you're not going to have that input changed, even though the underlying data changed. So for that, we want to create a life cycle that observes attribute changes, updates the variable, and thereby updates the input that is set inside of this input field. So for that, we want to go on the life cycle here, on attribute change, and on attribute change on this life cycle, we need to set the variable value that is bound with this input now. We need to go on fx, and this data needs to come from the current attribute value. So when the attribute changes, we're changing the variable, and when the variable changes, we're changing the underlying data that is shown inside of this input field, because the input value attribute, which sets the value of the input field reactively, comes from that changed variable. So when you work with components, it makes your life more complicated. It can help you streamline styling systems. It can help you use elements more often because you can isolate them in a box and you can then just reuse them. So you only have the pane once and then you can use it again and again and again. But I would suggest for beginners, just get familiar with the tool before you start following any best practices. everybody has their own best practices. Do what makes sense for you. If building something fully on the page for a first project makes sense for you, please do that. Don't expect that from yourself, that everything needs to be a component, everything needs to follow best practices. It really doesn't. At the end of the day, clients and yourself should only care about the result, how that software is operating, what value it's getting, how easy it is to maintain. You don't need to follow any sort of ideology. I'm not following any specific ideology or representing any specific ideology, how you should build things, because I think my ideology would be common sense. You should build things the way they make sense for you, and that should be it. And that should be sufficient, because if it doesn't make sense for you and you just follow that to follow best practices, you're not going to be able to maintain that, or you're not going to have the joy in maintaining that, or the ease of use, than if you would just follow something that right now at this time makes sense for you. Because as you develop more, you get smarter, you get better at what you do, and what may be right for you today and makes sense today may be wrong in a year, right? You develop as you build those things. So give yourself some time. You don't need to follow best practices right now. You may develop your own best practices in a year and everybody will follow that. But in a year, there'll be people who just started yesterday and they're going to look at your best practice and say, what the heck is that? That's crazy stuff. He's insane, right? So do what makes sense for you. Have some common sense in how you develop things. No ideologies need to be followed in that. Because at the end of the day, it's all personal preference and you should do what makes sense for you. But now that we have solved this problem, and setting this up on the page takes 1 minute, setting this up as a component did 20, with a little bit of explanation, right? But you get an idea that it's more complicated doing components. It will save you more time down the road, right? You can reuse it now in multiple projects and you have that functionality, but that is just something to consider. Now, we do have that value of that variable inside of here. And let's say we need to have a minimum of 5 characters in order for that checkbox to appear. So I'm now going on this div here on that checkbox. I'm going to do show height. I'm going to now take the thing that tracks the state in the component, which is the component variable, and I'm going to add the size filter to get the size. Right now it's 3, and I need to say greater than 4, because our minimum characters are 5. And then if that is false, it'll hide it. And if that is greater than 4, meaning 5 characters, let's try that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to get the checkbox. So now we have isolated state. We're sending out events with the data from the component variable to get it outside of here. And now if we go back to the page, we're going to see that we have a fully functional component. But one thing needs to be changed, because we have some outline here on this component. We want to go to this div here and want to make sure that the layout here has overflow visible, overflow visible. Let's try that. If not, we need to give it some padding. Yeah, that is some of the downsides when you use components for things like inputs. We now see that there is no rounded corners here because there is some overflow. So as you can see, rounded borders, but this is cutting it off a little bit. So we want to make sure for this use case, because we are styling the component, that's actually the issue. So in this example here, I want to remove the color, but it doesn't change. So if I do the color transparent, you see, then I'm going to, because the style is in the component, that's funky. There you go. But you see, now we have, because we did style the component itself. Now we have that inside of here. So now when I start typing, you're going to see that we have the validation because the state is inside of the component, right? So we have the validation here inside of the component with the check marks because there is a separate variable in the component. Then as I type in this component is emitting the onInput event, our custom HTML event, setting the variable with its event data, so you can see right here. And then to keep it back synced, we do have that attribute here that takes the initial value of that attribute. So when that attribute is hey with a smiley, we're going to have here hey with a smiley in that input. And that's actually passing the validation because of the state that we're tracking directly inside of that component. Now, let's say we have a button inside of here that is changing all of the sudden the attribute of that component. So changing the state that we're working with, what will happen? Let's call this button change. And now I go on the button, I go on events, I go on click. And on click of this button, I'm setting the text variable, which is synced with the input now, because we're working with it as an custom component. We go on fx, and, or actually, let's just hard code that. We're going to say join NoCode ProCode. Here you go. I love doing my advertisement. So now when I click inside of here, this will trigger a change to the variable that is on the page. So when I click on this button, it will change the page variable. If the page variable changes, because the variable is bound to this value input attribute here, as you can see, this is now changing the value of that attribute, which is registering the lifecycle that we have registered inside of the web component that I have open inside of here on attribute change, changing the variable inside of the web component, this value variable, and changing it with the current data of that attribute value that is inside of here. And because that variable is being changed with the updated attribute value in the input inside of here on the value attribute, we see that will change because it's reactively connected with that variable. So if we now go back to the home page here and I click on change, that's exactly what it's going to do now. We see the text in the input field changed, and because the text in the input field changed by an action that happened on the page, what it did was it registered that change from that attribute, right? It then changed the value, which registered in the HTML input event on input action because the input was changed programmatically, which then triggered the event that was sent outside of the web component here that then changed the variable on the page with the event data, which then changed this h1 here, which is bound to the variable that is on the page with the data coming from the web component. So those are all the life cycles. Now, before that, we had one life cycle or two. We had data coming into the input, data coming out to the input. Everything is bound on the page. Now we have the same life cycle that we have on the page here with the variable, plus some complexity inside of the web component. Now, web components are very beneficial. I use them for a lot of things. They can help you streamline and reuse actions that you will, or reuse elements and logic that you need throughout the page, so you can build your own styling. Not really. You can build your own functional system, like a switch, like a checkbox. That's where it really is smart. But I would not turn everything into a web component. You don't need web component modal 1, web component modal 2, web component modal 3. You want to kind of like think of building your own UI library inside of web components, your widgets, and then you work with slots to get dynamic data inside of there and all that stuff. Because when you build those components, you want to have them reusable. So you want to have your pop-up component work with a widget saying type delete here to delete this project, as well as click delete to delete this project, right? You want to keep in mind that you architecture them flexible. But again, brings me back to my point. If you're just starting with Toddle, it's probably simpler just building things on the page and using components where you see they make sense for you, because at the end of the day, it's all about what makes sense for you when you develop your application, because you're the one maintaining it and logging in and changing things and adding new stuff to it. And you'll build this at some point again, and by that, you'll be way smarter and you'll be following your own best practices. But that is how you work and understand the life cycles of web components inside of Toddle. I hope that this was very helpful for you, this video. Thank you so much for watching. And if you want to see more videos like this and get access to daily office hours and all that exciting stuff, I would highly suggest you to check out NoCodeProCode.com. That's how you spell it, NoCodeProCode.com. You look that up on your browser and you're going to come to this beautiful website here that will allow you to sign up for our exclusive community where we have daily office hours Monday to Friday. To help you with any roadblocks, we have now beginner office hours as well. So every second day, we'll have beginner office hours where we help you get started, answer your first questions, help you make your first steps inside of Toddle. And then we also have expert office hours helping you do advanced integrations, integrating DeepSeek AI streaming inside of your application, Stripe Elements, Stripe Connect, all that complicated stuff, front end and back end will help you with that. So it's great for beginners, it's great for experts, it's great for everyone. You also get access to an AI generator that will help you build web components inside of Toddle way faster and easier. Let me show you that. If I go inside of here, let's say, right, we were talking about components, right? There you go. Faster way of developing components now. It's free for members. I go inside of here, let's say confirm modal with banner image, right? Something simple. Let's go on run and deploy, confirm modal with banner image. It'll take a little bit, and now it's using AI, ML, machine learning, all that cool stuff to build this beautiful Toddle component. And you can copy that in one click. Here, copy for Toddle. I copied it a few times. That should not happen. And then when I go inside of my page here and just paste it, right? And then of course, because I'm on a dark theme here, right? So I should have probably generated that for dark mode, but I would change the text. Oh, I would change, here you go, the text to be black. And there you go. Got it beautifully inside of here. And then, you know, I can style those things to my liking. I can add an image inside of here. And there you go. That's how fast I build a modern ChatCN UI styled component with native Toddle styling, as you can see, following HTML best practices using REMS, right? So that is also your fastest way to follow best practices. And you'll learn, and you can take a look how the AI structures things, right? How things are, you know, how it's built, right? I think that is very beneficial. And it does it all responsive, by the way. So it uses the native Toddle responsive conventions, as you can see right inside of here, fully built by AI to speed up your development even more. So that's exciting stuff that is available for all NoCode Pro Code members. So go to nocodeprocode.com, sign up right now, get started, and I can't wait to see you on the inside of that community. Thank you so much for watching. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day, and take care and see you soon. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate that.